The first time Clara Whitmore saw the ranch, it was burning. Not the whole of it, just the eastern fence line where a brush fire had caught hold of the dry October grass and raced toward the barn like something with a grudge. And she was standing in the back of a rattling wagon watching orange tongues lick the twilight sky, while the driver cursed under his breath and slapped the reins harder. She had come all the way from St. Louis on a train, then from Dodge City on a stagecoach, then from the last outpost of civilization on that wagon, and the sight of fire eating the land she was supposed to make her new home should have sent her screaming back the way she had come. Instead, she grabbed the water barrel lashed to the wagon's side and jumped down before the wheels had stopped turning. She would think about that impulsive leap for years afterward. The way the ground hit her boots hard, the way the smoke stung her eyes before she had even found her footing, the way a man on a buckskin horse appeared out of the orange haze with a wet saddle blanket already in his hands, beating at the creeping flames with a kind of furious patience she had never witnessed before. He did not look like a man afraid of the fire. He looked like a man who had argued with it plenty of times and expected to win again tonight. His name was Elias Cade, and he was 26 years old, and he did not notice her until she was standing beside him with a soaking wet feed sack she had plunged into a horse trough, slapping at the grass fire with every ounce of strength she had. He glanced at her sideways, sweat cutting pale lines through the soot on his face, and said nothing at all for a long moment. Then he said, "You are going to ruin that dress." "It was already ruined by the stage from Dodge," she said, and kept hitting the fire. "They got it out before it reached the barn." The eastern fence was gone, just a line of blackened posts smoldering in the dirt, but the barn stood and the horses inside it were safe. And when the last ember died to a red wink and went dark, Elias Cade finally stopped moving. He stood with the ruined saddle blanket hanging from both hands and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. It was not quite surprise and not quite admiration and not quite something warmer than either of those. It was all three at once, and she was too tired and too soot-streaked to think much about it. "You are Clara Whitmore," he said. "I am," she said. He was quiet a moment. "My father hired you." "He did." Another pause, and then he said, "I am Elias. My father is inside. He has been ill since September." He looked toward the house, a solid two-story structure made of raw timber with a wide porch that faced south to catch the wind. "I should tell you now that things here are not exactly as he described them in his letters." She looked at the ruined fence, the scorched grass, the thin curl of smoke still rising from the earth. "I had begun to suspect as much," she said, and despite everything, she almost smiled. The year was 1878, and the Kansas plains stretched in every direction like the surface of some great inland sea, and Clara Whitmore had arrived at the Cade ranch as a housekeeper and general helper, hired by old Thomas Cade through an agency in St. Louis that matched desperate households with capable women willing to come west. She had been 23 years old, recently made an orphan by a fever that had taken her mother in August, and she had looked at the agency's notice board and decided that starting over somewhere entirely new was better than staying somewhere that felt entirely finished. She had not been wrong about that. What she had not fully anticipated was everything else. Thomas Cade was a broad-shouldered, silver-haired man of 58 who had once been the kind of man you could imagine breaking horses and arguing with blizzards, but the illness had shrunk him. He sat in a chair by the parlor window with a blanket across his knees and eyes that were still sharp enough to cut glass, and he took one look at her when she came inside, mud-soaked and smoke-smelling, and said, "I see you already met the place." "The place met me," she said. He laughed, a real laugh that bent him forward, and she decided right then that she liked him. The ranch employed 3 ranch hands besides Elias. There was Pete, who was stocky and sun-darkened, and had been with the Cads since before Elias was born. There was a young man named Domingo from south of the border, whose full name was Domingo Reyes, and who spoke English with the precision of someone who had learned it deliberately and completely. and who could read weather in the color of the sky in a way that Pete and Elias both trusted without question. And there was a quiet, long-limbed man everyone called Cully, who had ridden in from the east 4 years earlier and had simply never left, and who could fix almost anything mechanical with a piece of wire and a silence that suggested the machine ought to be ashamed of itself. Clara learned the ranch in the way you learn a river, by following where it wants to go and paying attention to where the currents are dangerous. She cooked on a cast iron stove that had its own opinions and got up before the sun every morning to have coffee ready when the men came in from the early feeding. And she managed Thomas's medicines, which the doctor in the nearest town of Harlow had written out in a careful hand. And she mended things and cleaned things, and kept the accounts when Thomas's hands shook too badly to manage the columns himself. She was good at it. She had always been practical in a way that some people mistook for coldness, but it was not coldness at all. It was simply that she had learned early that love and competence were not separate things. Taking care of something properly was its own kind of feeling. Elias watched her the way you watch something you are not entirely sure you understand yet, not with suspicion, but with attention. He was a quiet man in the way that open country makes people quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned to be selective about when speech was worth the silence it replaced. He worked from before dawn until after dark, and he carried the weight of the ranch on him with a steadiness that looked effortless until you caught him in an unguarded moment and saw how tired his eyes were. October turned to November, and the first frost came, and Clara learned that Kansas winters were not gentle things. The wind came down from the north with a meanness in it that cut through everything she owned, and she stood at the kitchen window one morning watching snow scatter across the yard and thought about St. Louis in a way that was not exactly homesick, but was something adjacent to it. A kind of awareness that she had left something familiar behind without knowing yet what she had traded it for. Elias came in for coffee and stood beside her at the window and said, "First winter out here. Is it that obvious?" "You are looking at the snow like it has personally offended you," he said, and she heard the almost smile in his voice without needing to turn and see it. "In St. Louis the snow was something that happened to the city," she said. "Here it seems to be something that happens to you specifically." He considered that. "That is a fair way to put it," he said. He poured his coffee and wrapped both hands around the cup and said, "It gets harder before it gets easier, but then it does get easier." She looked at him then, and he was looking at the yard with that same focused, quiet attention he gave to everything, and she thought that was either a very simple thing to say or a very complicated one, and she was not sure yet which. Thomas got worse in November and a little better in December, which was the pattern his illness seemed to prefer, this cruel, teasing rhythm of recovery and retreat. Clara sat with him in the evenings sometimes, when the supper was done and the accounts were closed, and he told her about building the ranch in the years after the war, about Elias' mother who had died of a fever when Elias was 11, and who had been, by all accounts, a remarkable woman. He spoke about her with a grief so long seasoned it had become something almost peaceful, the way old wood gets smooth. "Elias took it hard," Thomas said one evening, the fire low in the grate. "Not in the way children usually take it, all noise and tears. He just went quiet, and he has been quiet in some part of himself ever since." "He seems all right," Clara said carefully. "He is more than all right," Thomas said, with a note of pride sharp enough to be fierce. "He is the best man I know. But he has been holding everything at arm's length since he was 11 years old, and that is not a way for a person to live their whole life." She did not know how to answer that, and Thomas did not seem to expect her to. He just looked at the fire and let the statement settle in the room between them like something he had needed to say out loud. On Christmas Eve, which fell on a Tuesday in 1878, a snowstorm came in from the north with a seriousness that was almost spectacular. The wind hit the house like something solid, and the drifts built against the walls and the porch until the lower windows were half buried. And Clara baked bread because there was nothing else sensible to do, and the smell of it filled the house from the kitchen to the upper rooms, and Pete said it was the best smell he had been within 100 miles of in 3 years. They ate together, all of them, crowded around the long table in the kitchen because it was warmer than the dining room, and Thomas came down from his chair by the fire and sat at the head of the table with a color in his face that was almost healthy. And Domingo told a story about a Christmas he had spent in Sonora that was either completely true or beautifully invented, and Cully laughed for the first time Clara had witnessed, which transformed his whole face into something unexpected and young. And Pete got out the bottle of whiskey he kept in his bunkhouse and shared it around, and someone found a slightly damaged harmonica, and they sang things badly and with great feeling. At some point late in the evening, Clara went to stand on the porch despite the cold, because the storm had paused in that particular way that winter storms sometimes do, holding its breath between one assault and the next, and the sky had gone clear and enormous and black, absolutely packed with stars the way the sky only gets when there is no light for 100 miles in any direction, and the air has been washed clean by snow. She stood with her shawl pulled tight and her breath making white clouds and felt something crack open in her chest, something she did not have a name for. She heard the door open behind her and knew, by the weight of the footstep, that it was Elias. He stood beside her and looked up. "There they are," he said quietly. "Do you ever get used to it?" she asked. "No," he said. "I have been looking at this sky my whole life and I have not gotten used to it. I think if you get used to it, something has gone wrong." She thought about that. "I like that," she said. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Are you glad you came?" It was the most direct personal question he had asked her since she arrived, and it surprised her enough that she took a moment before answering, wanting to be honest rather than polite. "I think I am," she said. "I think I was running away from something and running toward something at the same time, and I have not entirely sorted out which is which yet. But when I look at that sky, it feels like the running was worth it." He did not say anything for a long time after that, but he did not go inside either. They stood side by side on the cold porch looking at the frozen stars until the storm breathed itself back to life and drove them in. And for the first time since she had arrived, Clara Whitmore felt like she was standing somewhere she was supposed to be. January was brutal and relentless in the way that only Kansas in 1879 could be. The cattle had to be fed by hand because the grazing was buried, and the water in the troughs froze nightly, and the men worked in conditions that would have seemed punishing by any fair measure, and did it without complaint because complaint did not change the temperature. Clara kept the house warm and the food coming, and learned to read the weather off Domingo's face the way she had learned to read the stove's moods off the color of its smoke. Thomas had a bad week in the middle of January, bad enough that Elias rode the 12 miles to Harlow in a blizzard to bring the doctor back. Clara sat with Thomas through 2 long nights with a cloth on his forehead and his medicines timed to the hour, and when the doctor arrived and examined him and said he had held his own, she felt the relief in her knees and had to sit down. Elias found her in the kitchen afterward, sitting at the table with her hands flat on the wood and her eyes closed. "He is going to be all right," Elias said. "I know," she said. "The doctor said so." "You did well," Elias said, "keeping him through those nights." "The doctor said so too, though he used different words." She opened her eyes. Elias was standing in the kitchen doorway, his coat still on, melting snow dripping from the brim of his hat, and he looked at her with something in his face that was naked enough to make her breath catch. It was there and then it was not, covered back up with that practiced steadiness. "Anyone would have done it," she said. "No," he said simply, "not anyone." And then he went back out into the cold. February came in like a lion looking for a fight, and it was in February that the trouble with Harker started. Birch Harker owned the ranch to the west of the Cads, and he had been making offers to buy the Cade land for 2 years, each offer a little more pointed than the last. He wanted the creek water rights that came with the Cade property, and the fact that Thomas kept declining had given the offers an increasingly unpleasant edge. Harker was not a man who accepted no as anything more than a temporary obstacle, and he had enough money and enough men in his employ to make the Cade's lives difficult in small but accumulating ways. The February incident was a cut fence on the north pasture that let 40 head of Cade cattle drift onto Harker land, where Harker's men promptly claimed them as strays and drove them to the stockyards in Harlow before Elias could get there to dispute it. The county law was a man named Sheriff Toby Prout, who was not corrupt exactly, but who had a habit of siding with whoever had more resources. And by the time Elias had ridden to Harlow and argued his case, and produced his bill of sale and brand registry, and presented them to Prout, Harker's lawyer had already been there first with papers that were more plentiful if not more legitimate. Elias came back with 30 of the 40 head, and a tension in his jaw that Clara had not seen before. She did not ask him about it immediately. She set supper in front of him and let him eat, and when Thomas had gone up to bed and Pete and Domingo and Cully had retired to the bunkhouse, she poured 2 cups of coffee and set one across the table from her and said, "Tell me about it." He looked at the coffee for a moment. Then he told her. Not in the angry rush she might have expected, but in the even, methodical way he had of explaining things, each fact placed carefully after the last, and she listened without interrupting and thought about it when he was done. "The fence was cut deliberately," she said. "Almost certainly," he said. "Can you prove it?" "The cut was clean. Wire cutters not wear. Domingo saw it." He paused. But Domingo seeing it and a court accepting that are different things. She thought about what Thomas had told her in one of their evening conversations about the county recorder's office in Harlow and the land grants filed there. "Your father's original land grant, is it recorded?" "It is." "And the water rights?" "Part of the grant. Original terms from when he filed in '69. She nodded slowly. "Then it seems to me that the next time Harker's men come near your fence line, you need witnesses there first. Not just Domingo, not just your own men." She looked at him steadily. "Harlow has a newspaper." He looked at her. "A newspaper," she said again. "And a reporter who I suspect would find the story of a man trying to steal his neighbor's water rights and cattle more interesting than whatever else is happening in a town that size." Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then something in his face shifted, some tightening became a loosening, and he said, "That is a better idea than anything I came up with on the ride home." "You were angry on the ride home," she said. "Anger is useful, but it is not subtle." He almost smiled. It reached his eyes this time, which she had begun to notice was rarer than the almost smile and therefore meant more. "Where did you learn to think like that?" he asked. "My father ran a dry goods store," she said. "He had a competitor on the next block for 11 years. I grew up watching him figure out how to compete without starting a war he could not win." "Did it work?" "The competitor moved to Chicago in 1872, she said. "So yes." That was the first time Elias laughed, a real full laugh, and it was the best thing she had heard in weeks. They rode to Harlow together the following week, which caused a small stir in town, because people had opinions about an unmarried woman riding alongside a man to conduct business. But Clara had decided that other people's opinions about her conduct were a luxury she could not afford, and they both went to the newspaper office and found the editor, a thin, intense man named Josiah Webb, who had come west from Cincinnati with a printing press and opinions enough to fill it. And he was indeed very interested in the story. The article Webb published 3 weeks later did not directly accuse Harker of anything, but it raised very pointed questions about the circumstances of the cattle incident and about the pattern of fence troubles along the boundary of the Harker and Cade properties, and it quoted the county land records at length in a way that made the water rights situation very clear to anyone reading. Harker rode to Harlow in a fury and threatened Webb, which Webb then also published, and the whole business became something the county could not ignore. Sheriff Prout came out to the Cade ranch in March with Harker's lawyer and a deputy, and there was a tense hour in the front yard in early spring mud, and Elias stood his ground with a steadiness that Clara watched from the porch with something that was not quite pride but was adjacent to it. And by the end of it, the lawyer had backed down on the cattle claim, and the sheriff had formally warned Harker's men to stay clear of Cade fences. It did not end the problem entirely, but it changed the shape of it. Harker became more cautious, which was not the same as being better but was significantly safer to live next to. That evening Thomas came downstairs for the first time in 2 weeks and sat at the table and ate a full supper and said to Elias, "I hear it went all right." "It went well enough," Elias said. Thomas looked at Clara. "Josiah Webb told me in a letter that the newspaper story was your idea." "Elias did the talking," she said. "He usually does," Thomas said, "but that was not what I asked." He looked at her with those sharp eyes that illness had not dulled at all. "You are a clever woman, Clara Whitmore." "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "I am glad I hired you," he said. "More glad than I knew how to anticipate." Spring on the Kansas plains was its own kind of spectacular, sudden and violent and green in a way that made the gray of winter seem impossible to believe. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and the meadows came up in waves of grass that the wind moved like water, and the sky was a blue so saturated it seemed almost aggressive, and Clara found herself going outside simply to stand in it, tilting her face up, breathing the smell of wet earth and new things. She had begun to love the land. It crept up on her without announcement, the way important things often did, and she found one morning that she cared about the North Pasture's grass the way she cared about things that belonged to her, which was a startling recognition. Elias found her standing at the edge of the creek one April morning, her boots off and her feet in the cold water because it seemed like the right thing to do, and he stopped on the bank above her and looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when something had caught him off guard. "That water is still very cold," he said. "I know," she said. "It is wonderful." He sat down on the bank above her. He was not a man who sat still often, and the fact that he did now, setting his hat on his knee and letting his hands hang loose, felt significant. "My mother used to do that," he said. "Every spring first warm day. She said it was a way of reminding your body it was still alive." Clara looked up at him. "You do not talk about her often." "No," he said. "Do you want to?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the water moving around her feet. "She would have liked you," he said finally. She had no patience for pretense. She said what she meant and she did what she said, and she was afraid of almost nothing. He paused. "You remind me of her sometimes. Not in the way you look, but in the way you are in a room. The way a room feels different when you are in it." The water ran cold and bright over her feet, and she stood very still and looked at him and knew, with the clarity that sometimes arrives all at once rather than gradually, that she was in serious danger of loving this man. She had been circling it for months without allowing herself to look directly at it, the way you do not look directly at the sun, and now it had turned and looked back at her, and there was nowhere left to pretend. She did not say any of this. She said, "That is a beautiful thing to tell someone." "It is only true," he said. She climbed back up the bank and sat beside him and put her boots back on, and they sat for a while in the April morning listening to the creek, and it was the most companionable silence she had ever been part of. Spring brought cattle drives through the area, and the particular kind of disruption that meant drovers camping near the creek, which was legal as long as they moved on, and the atmosphere of transience that Clara found both fascinating and a little melancholy. These were men who lived in motion, for whom home was a bedroll and a fire, and she watched them from the ranch with a complicated feeling that was partly her old restlessness, and partly the recognition that she was no longer restless in the same direction. One drover stopped to ask for water and stayed for lunch when Clara offered it, a weathered man of perhaps 40 named Samuel who had been trailing cattle from Texas since he was 18. He sat at the kitchen table and ate everything in front of him with serious gratitude and told her about the country south of there, about the dust and the heat and the wide rivers that could drown a horse without warning. "You settled here." he asked her, looking at the kitchen around him with the particular attention of someone who does not expect to be anywhere long enough for things to feel permanent. "I work here," she said, which had been true when she arrived but felt incomplete now in a way she could not quite articulate. "Seems like a good place," he said. "Good land, good people." She thought of Elias and Thomas and Pete and Domingo and Cully. "Yes," she said. "Good people." He nodded like something had been confirmed. "That is the whole of it, really," he said. "The land is just land. It is the people that make the difference." He rode on in the afternoon, and she stood on the porch and watched him go and thought about what he had said. In May, Thomas had a relapse that was the worst yet. 3 days where his breathing was shallow and his fever climbed, and the doctor rode out from Harlow and stayed overnight because the ride back was not safe in the dark. And Clara and Elias kept the house going in a kind of exhausted tandem, trading off at Thomas's bedside, sleeping in chairs, keeping the household and the ranch moving because it had to keep moving. On the third night, Thomas's fever broke. It broke suddenly, the way fevers sometimes do, all at once like a storm passing, and when Clara pressed the cloth to his forehead and found it cool and his breathing deepened into something more like real sleep, she sat back in the chair and pressed her hands over her face and let herself shake for a moment, quietly, in the dark. Elias came to the doorway and saw her and came inside without a word and sat down in the other chair, and they sat together in the dark room listening to Thomas breathe. And after a while, Elias reached across and put his hand over hers where it lay on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand over and held on. They did not talk. They did not need to. They sat like that until the dawn came gray through the curtains, and Thomas slept through all of it and looked more himself than he had in 3 days, and when Clara finally stood to go make coffee her hand felt cold where his had been, and she carried that sensation into the morning like it was something she did not want to put down. June came in warm and generous, and Thomas, contrary to everyone's cautious expectations, had one of his better periods. He came downstairs every day. He sat on the porch in the mornings and supervised things with the authoritative opinions of a man who has opinions about everything and has earned the right to express them. And he told Elias 3 separate times that the south pasture fencing needed attention in a way that made Elias close his eyes briefly each time and say, "Yes, Father," he knew. Clara was in the garden she had planted in April, a modest kitchen garden behind the house with the practical things she needed, and a few flowers that she had included purely because she wanted them, when Elias came around the side of the house and stopped at the garden gate. "You are good at that," he said. She was kneeling in the dirt staking the bean plants, and she looked up at him with dirt on her hands and her hair coming loose from its pins and said, "At kneeling in the dirt. At making things grow," he said. He leaned on the gate post. "My mother had a garden here, same spot. It did not survive her." He paused. "Nothing grew in it for 15 years. She looked at the garden and then at him. "It is good soil," she said. "It just needed attention." He was looking at her in that way he had, that direct, unguarded attention that he usually caught and covered before it went too far, and this time he did not cover it. He held her gaze for a long moment that felt like it had weight and temperature. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said, and she was still kneeling in the dirt and she did not care. "I do not know how to do this with any skill," he said. "I have not had occasion to practice, but I think you should know that I have been thinking about you almost entirely and continuously since October." She sat back on her heels. Her heart was doing something dramatic. "Since October," she said. "Since you jumped off that wagon and hit a brush fire with a wet feed sack," he said. "Yes, since October." She thought about what Thomas had said in February about Elias holding everything at arm's length since he was 11 years old. She thought about how much it must have cost him to say that, this man who measured his words so carefully and guarded his interior life with such disciplined patience. "I have been thinking about you too," she said. He opened the garden gate and came inside and offered her his hand, and she took it and let him pull her to her feet, and they stood in the June garden with the beans staked up around them and the first roses just beginning to show color, and he looked at her like she was the most serious thing he had ever considered. "Would you let me court you properly?" he said. "I am aware that your situation here is complicated by the fact that you work for my father, and I do not want to put you in a position that is uncomfortable or—" "Elias," she said. "Yes. Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes to which part?" "Yes to all of it," she said. "Yes to everything you were going to say and to the things you were not going to say because you would think them presumptuous. Yes." Something happened in his face then, a slow opening like a window being raised, like light coming into a room that had been closed for a long time. He raised her hand, which still had dirt on it, and held it for a moment, and then he said, "All right then," in a voice that was quieter than usual and entirely warm. Courting in the summer of 1879 on a Kansas cattle ranch was not a candlelit or operatic affair, but it was theirs and it was real. It was riding the fence line together in the evenings and sitting on the porch steps after supper talking about everything and nothing until the stars came out. It was him teaching her to read weather and her teaching him to keep proper accounts in the way her father had taught her, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger between them and their heads closed together. It was small arguments about practical things that ended in mutual admission, rather than the maintenance of positions neither of them actually believed in. It was him appearing at the kitchen door with wildflowers he had found on the south pasture that he presented without ceremony, and she received with a kind of joy that embarrassed her by its intensity. Thomas watched all of it from his porch chair with an expression of deep satisfaction and said absolutely nothing about it, which was the most restrained he had been about anything in years, which told Clara more about how much he approved than any words would have. Domingo told Pete that it was about time, and Pete said he had known since November, and Cully said nothing because Cully rarely did but shook Elias' hand one morning in the barn in a way that communicated clearly what Cully felt, which was that this was good and right, and he was glad of it. In August, Elias kissed her for the first time in the kitchen while she was making biscuits, which was not a romantic setting by any theatrical measure but was completely appropriate for who they were, and she had flour on her hands when she turned, and he was closer than she had expected, and he said, "I have been trying to find the right moment for this for 6 weeks," and she said, "You were overthinking it," and then he kissed her and she stopped thinking about anything useful at all for a considerable time. The biscuits were slightly overdone. She did not care. Summer became fall again, and the grass went amber and the sky went that particular clear October blue that Clara had decided was the most beautiful color available to the naked eye. And one morning she was standing on the porch with her coffee, watching the light come across the plains, and she thought, with a completeness that surprised her, that she did not want to be anywhere else. She had been thinking about her contract with Thomas, which was for 1 year and would expire in October. She had not raised the subject because she did not know how to raise it without exposing how much it mattered, which was a peculiar kind of vulnerability for a practical woman who was not accustomed to exposing things. Elias raised it first. He found her on the porch that evening after supper, the sun going down in sheets of gold and orange behind the western hills, and he sat down beside her on the porch steps and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Your year is almost up." "I know," she said. "My father would like you to stay," he said. "He has not said so in direct terms because he does not want to appear to be managing things that are not his business. But I know him and I know what that deliberate silence means." She looked at the sunset. "What do you want?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "I want you to stay," he said. "But I want to say it right and I am working up to saying it right, so I am asking you to be patient with me for just a moment." She waited. "I have thought about my life, the shape of it before you came, and I can see it clearly when I think about it," he said. "It was a good life. It was useful and honest and there were things in it I valued. But it was narrow, Clara. It was narrow in a way I had accepted because I did not know what I was missing." He turned to look at her. "I know now. And I am asking you to stay, not just for this winter. I am asking you to stay." She looked at him in the golden October light and understood that this was the real question, not the practical one about her contract, but the deeper one underneath it, the one that was asking her to choose this place and these people and this man as the shape of her life going forward. "Ask me to stay," she said quietly. "Stay," he said. "Please stay. Stay with me." She reached out and put her hand against his face, and he turned into it like something long cold turning toward warmth, and she said, "Yes, I will stay." He asked her to marry him 3 days later, formally and seriously, on the south porch in the morning, because that was when the light was best, and also because he was not a man who could sleep on something that important, and he had spent those 3 days composing himself and his words, and deciding there was no reason to wait. He asked her and she said yes, and he put his grandmother's ring on her finger, a simple gold band with a small garnet that he had kept in his father's strongbox for years, and it fit as if it had been made for her. Thomas cried when they told him, briefly and with evident embarrassment, and then recovered himself and said that he was not crying but that the morning air was affecting his eyes, and Clara kissed him on the forehead and told him she knew, and Pete shook everyone's hand 3 times, and Domingo said he had known since November, and Cully appeared to experience a private emotion, and then went to fix the wagon wheel he had been meaning to fix for a week. They were married in December of 1879, in the parlor of the ranch house, with the Reverend Andrews from Harlow conducting the service and Thomas standing up straight despite everything his body said about that, and Domingo as witness, and Pete and Cully and the rancher and his wife from 2 miles east, who Clara had befriended over the summer. It was a small ceremony and entirely themselves, without the formal trappings she might once have imagined for such an event, and she stood opposite Elias in her best dress with the fire going in the grate and the snow falling outside the windows, and said her vows to him with a certainty that was the opposite of performing certainty. That was simply true. He said his vows in a voice that was perfectly steady and completely full, and he looked at her the whole time as if she were the only fixed point in a turning world. And when Andrews pronounced them married and Elias kissed her, Pete whooped loud enough to startle the horses in the barn. The winter of their marriage was the second winter she had spent at the ranch, and the first one where she was not alone in her room above the kitchen. The storms came and the cold came, and it was hard in all the physical ways that winter on the plains is always hard. But there was a warmth in the house that had not been there before, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the grate, and she felt it every morning when she opened her eyes. Elias was a careful man in all things. He was careful with the land, and careful with his father, and careful with the people who depended on him. He was careful with her in a way that was not caution but was tenderness, a deliberate attention to what she needed and what she felt, and she had not been prepared for how transformative it was to be known that thoroughly by another person. She told him things she had never told anyone, not from confession, but from the ease of a person who has found someone who will receive what they offer without distortion. She told him about her parents and the dry goods store, and the particular loneliness of being a practical, capable person in a city that seemed to value only one kind of woman. He listened with the focused patience that she had come to understand was one of the most fundamental things about him. He told her about his mother, about the months after she died, about being 11 years old and watching his father become someone he did not recognize for almost a full year, about deciding somewhere in that year that needing people was the most dangerous thing you could do. He told her with the deliberate, slightly effortful quality of someone saying a thing they have never said before, and she understood what it meant that he was saying it. That was a long time to carry that, she said. It was, he said. You can put it down, she said. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, I think I have been these past months. I think you have been helping me put it down without my noticing. She thought that was perhaps the most she had ever been given in words by anyone. Thomas improved through the winter of 1879, and into 1880 in a way the doctor called remarkable. Not a recovery in the complete sense. His constitution had been changed by the illness, and that was permanent, but a kind of stabilization that allowed him more of himself than he had had in the past year. He came down to breakfast every morning and rode out short distances in the spring, not to work but to look at things, and he sat with Clara in the evenings and talked, and he told her that having her in the house had done as much for him as the medicine. A house with a woman who gives a damn is a different place, he said with his typical directness. I had forgotten. You had Elias, she said. Elias is my son, and I love him more than I know how to say, but he is still a man, and men do not make a house, Thomas said. No disrespect intended to Elias. He would agree with you, she said. He would, Thomas said. He told me once when he was about 20 that the ranch felt like a place where things were maintained but not lived. I did not have an answer for that then. I do now. In April of 1880, Clara knew she was expecting a child. She told Elias in the kitchen one morning early, before anyone else was up, because she did not want to tell him in front of people and did not want to wait. She watched his face as she told him and saw things move through it in sequence. Surprise, then a kind of joy so large it seemed to be looking for a way out of his face, then something much quieter than joy, a solemnity that she understood was the gravity of it landing. He sat down at the kitchen table because his legs seemed to require it. She sat across from him. He looked at her for a long time. You are certain, he said. I am certain, she said. He reached across and took both her hands in both of his and held them on the table between them, and he said, in a voice that was entirely stripped of any practiced composure, I am so glad, Clara. I am so incredibly glad. She felt tears she had not expected and blinked them back, and then thought, who is she blinking tears back for out here in this kitchen in the dark with no one to see, and let them come. Thomas's reaction when they told him was to go silent for a full 30 seconds, which was unprecedented, and then stand up from his chair and put his arms around both of them at once, all three of them together in the parlor, and say nothing at all, which said everything. The summer of 1880 was a long, warm, eventful one. The ranch had a good year. The cattle were healthy. The grass was good. The water held in the creek through July when it sometimes didn't, and they were able to hire a fourth ranch hand, a steady young man from Missouri named Arlo who had come west looking for work and found it, and was grateful in the uncomplicated way of someone whose needs are being met. Pete took him under his wing with the slightly bossed air of a man who has been waiting for someone to instruct. Domingo's sister came to visit in June from south of the border, a journey she had made partly by train and partly by wagon and entirely by determination. And she stayed 3 weeks, and she and Clara developed a friendship that was entirely genuine, and that Clara valued for its particular quality of warmth without complication. A friendship between two women who understood each other's practical intelligence and respected it. Clara named her Maria in her head, this friendship, not for the woman but for the feeling, the way some things become named without ceremony. The Harker situation resolved itself in August in a way no one had entirely anticipated. Birch Harker, facing the continuing cost of legal disputes and the reputational damage of the newspaper coverage, which Josiah Webb had maintained with the fidelity of a man who had found his cause, sold his ranch to a cattle company from Abilene and left the county. The cattle company had no interest in water rights arguments and wanted good relations with their neighbors, and the new manager came out in September, a calm man named Forsyth, and shook Elias' hand and said he hoped they could be useful to each other, and he meant it. The relief was considerable. Not just the relief of the specific problem being resolved, but the relief of not having to exist in a sustained state of defensive vigilance. Elias spent an entire evening on the porch after Forsyth left, just sitting quietly in a way that Clara understood was decompression. You have been carrying that for 2 years, she said. Longer, he said. Harker started with his offers before I told you about it. You could have told me sooner, she said, not with reproach but with a kind of open observation. I know, he said. I was not yet accustomed to telling people things. You are getting better at it, she said. I have good encouragement, he said, and looked at her with that warm directness that still, after a year of marriage, had the power to arrest her completely. Their son was born in November of 1880, in the room above the kitchen that had been Clara's room when she arrived, which felt right to her in a way she did not fully explain to anyone. The birth was long and difficult enough that by the end of it Clara had revised her assessment of her own pain tolerance dramatically upward. But the doctor was there, and Elias was there, which was not universally done in 1880, but which he had simply refused to be separated from, and Clara had not argued. And when the baby arrived and cried, that particular sound in that room, Elias sat beside her on the bed and held his son for the first time, and looked at him with an expression that Clara knew she would be able to find in her memory for the rest of her life, no matter how long or short that life might be. They named him Thomas James Cade, Thomas for his grandfather and James for Clara's father. Old Thomas came upstairs for the occasion, which cost him considerably in terms of the effort but which nothing could have prevented, and held the baby for a while with a steadiness that was careful and deliberate and full, and said, "He has your eyes, Clara." "He has Elias' forehead," she said. "That is so," Thomas said with satisfaction. "He is going to be very serious." "If he is half as serious as his father and a quarter as practical as his mother, he will be all right," Elias said, and Clara laughed, which surprised her because she was exhausted beyond the capacity for surprise. And Thomas laughed too, and the baby looked at all of them with the focused indignation of someone who has just arrived and has opinions about the noise level. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was the third winter Clara had spent at the ranch, and the first one with a baby in the house. It changed the nature of everything in ways she had anticipated, and in ways she had not. She had anticipated the exhaustion and the constant vigilance and the particular shape that love takes when it is directed at something entirely helpless and entirely trusting. She had not anticipated how much it would change Elias. She had thought she knew him fully by now. She had been wrong, not in the sense that she had been mistaken about his character, but in the sense that there was more of him to know. The man who held Thomas James in the evenings and talked to him quietly about the ranch and the weather, and what the south pasture looked like in spring, was a different expression of the same man she had married, deeper and more open. And she watched it happening with a feeling of such profound gratitude that she did not have language adequate to it. Old Thomas doted on the baby with a completeness that was touching and occasionally required management, since his ideas about what a baby needed were formed in the 1850s and required some updating, which Clara accomplished with a combination of genuine respect for his experience and firm redirection of specifics. They found an equilibrium that worked. Elias and Clara had long conversations that winter by the fire after the baby was asleep, the kind of conversations that exist in the space opened up by having built something together, not just the ranch or the house or the practical life, but the interior thing, the shared understanding of each other. She told him one night that she thought about October sometimes. The first October, arriving on the wagon, the fire, him in the smoke with the saddle blanket. How different everything might have been if the wind had been blowing the other way, if the fire had not been visible, if she had arrived in the dark and simply gone inside. "I think about it too," he said. "What do you think when you think about it?" she asked. "I think about how much was almost not," he said, "and how glad I am that it was." He looked at the fire. "I think about jumping off that wagon. You did not hesitate." "I did not have time to think," she said. "No," he said. "That is when you find out what kind of person someone is. When there is no time to decide, you jumped." He paused. "I had already decided what kind of person you were before you got the sack out of the trough." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "What kind did you decide?" "The right kind," he said simply. Spring of 1881 came, and Thomas James learned to hold his head up and then to sit, and then to pull himself upright against anything solid enough to support him. And the ranch went on in the way it did, demanding and seasonal and absorbing. Pete turned 53, and they had a supper for him that he claimed was unnecessary and clearly loved. Domingo received a letter from his family in Sonora with news that required him to go home for a month, and he left and returned as he said he would. And the month without him reminded everyone how much they relied on his particular understanding of the land and the weather. Arlo proved himself over the course of the year in the quiet way that competent people do, and Elias gave him a small increase in wages that made Arlo's face do something complicated and grateful. In the summer of 1881, Clara and Elias had their first serious argument. It was about the Harlow school. There was talk of a teacher leaving, and Clara, who had been corresponding with the county school board about various things for over a year because she had a natural interest in how the county's children were being educated, had written a letter to the county commissioner suggesting that the school needed not just a replacement teacher, but an expansion of its terms and resources. Elias thought she had overreached without discussing it with him first, not because he disagreed with the substance, but because he felt the decision to put their family into the middle of county politics was something they should have agreed on together. She thought he was being territorially cautious in a way that was unfair to her judgment. He thought she was being impulsive in a way that could create obligations they had not chosen. They were both partly right and both partly wrong, which is the usual condition of arguments between people who know each other well enough to be accurate about each other's faults. They worked it out over 2 days of somewhat pointed politeness that gave way to a genuine conversation that gave way to an agreement that had more nuance than either position they had started with. And the agreement was that she would pursue the school board correspondence, but they would discuss it before any commitments were made, and that he would tell her when he felt she was moving faster than he could keep up with rather than waiting until it had built into a complaint. She thought afterward that working through it had told her something important and good about what they had built together. Arguments between people who love each other and are committed to each other do not have to be destructive. They can be information. Old Thomas said nothing about the argument, which he had certainly been aware of because the ranch house was not a large building. He said nothing until it was clearly resolved, and then he said, to no one in particular at breakfast, "Nothing tests a marriage like the first real one, and nothing proves it either." Clara and Elias both looked at him. He applied himself to his eggs with great innocence. "You are not subtle, father," Elias said. "I have never claimed to be," Thomas said comfortably. The school board letter did result in the county appointing a new teacher, a capable woman from Lawrence named Miss Helen Carr, who turned out to be exactly what the school needed, and who became someone Clara respected greatly over the following years. The school's terms were extended the following year, and while this was not solely the result of Clara's correspondence, her letters were referenced in the county meeting that decided it, which satisfied her in the way that practical outcomes always did. In the fall of 1881, Clara discovered she was expecting a second child. She told Elias in the south pasture, because they had taken to riding together in the evenings when the work was done, and Thomas James was with Pete, who had developed a relationship with the baby that involved an extensive series of made-up songs and a great deal of patience on Pete's part and giggling on the baby's. And she told him while they were sitting on their horses at the high point of the pasture where you could see a long way in every direction. He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "Thomas James is going to be insufferable about this," and she laughed so hard her horse shifted sideways in surprise. "He is barely a year old," she said. "He already has opinions," Elias said. "He gets it from you." She reached across the space between their horses and he met her hand and held it for a moment, and the planes went out in every direction in the amber afternoon light, and she thought, "This is my life. This exact thing. This is it." The second winter was easier in its logistics than the first with a baby, because they knew what they were doing now, but harder in that Thomas had a bad month in January of 1882 that was frightening in its severity. The doctor came twice, and Clara managed the medicines with the precision and care that had become a kind of second nature, and Elias sat with his father through the worst nights with the same quiet steadiness he brought to everything. Thomas came through. He was diminished again on the other side, smaller and more tired, but himself. He sat in his chair and looked at Thomas James pulling himself around the parlor floor with furious determination, and he said to Clara, "I would like to see this one born." "You will," she said. "You are not supposed to promise things you cannot guarantee," he said, but gently. "I am promising anyway," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You have been the best thing to happen to this family in a very long time," he said. "I want you to know that I know it." She sat beside him and took his hand, and they were quiet together, and Thomas James made it to the far end of the parlor and looked back at them with an expression of triumph that was so purely Elias that she almost had to look away from the familiarity of it. Their daughter was born in June of 1882, in the same room with the same doctor, and Elias was there again. And this time it was faster and Clara was still exhausted, but the particular terror of the unknown was not there, replaced by something that was demanding but not frightening. The baby was fierce and loud from the first moment, and looked at the world with an assessing directness that Thomas, from his chair, said with great satisfaction was exactly how Clara had looked at the place when she first arrived. They named her Elena Rose, for no one in particular, and for both of them in the general way that some names work. And Thomas James, at 18 months old, regarded his sister with profound suspicion for approximately 1 week, and then appointed himself her guardian with a seriousness that made every adult in the house have to look away to hide their feelings. Old Thomas held Elena the way he had held Thomas James, with that careful attention, and said, "There you are," to her in a voice that Clara had only heard him use with the things he loved most, and Elena looked at him with those wide new eyes and seemed, inexplicably, to settle. He held on through the summer. He held on through fall and into the following winter, which was milder than the last, and he sat on the porch when the weather allowed and watched the land he had built something on, and said things that Clara stored like provisions against a long journey, things she knew she would return to. He died in February of 1883, quietly in his sleep, which the doctor said was the best way and which Clara understood was true and which did not make it smaller. Elias held himself together with a thoroughness that was costing him. She could see exactly what it was costing him, and she did not try to argue him out of his steadiness or suggest that falling apart would be better. She simply stayed close and made sure he was eating and sleeping and that there was always someone nearby. And on the third night after Thomas's death, she woke in the dark to find Elias sitting on the edge of the bed with his back to her, very still. She sat up and put her hand on his back. He did not turn. He said, "He told me last fall, he said he was ready. He said he had had a good life and he was not afraid and he was glad of everything." He stopped. I told him I was glad too. I did not tell him what I meant by that. "He knew," she said. "I hope so," Elias said. "He knew," she said again. "He was not a man who missed things. He knew what you meant." Elias put his hand over hers on his back, and she leaned her forehead against his shoulder, and they stayed like that in the dark while the Kansas plains lay cold and quiet in every direction outside their window. Thomas Cade's funeral was attended by more people than anyone anticipated, because he had known and been respected by nearly everyone in the county across the 20-some years. He had lived there and worked there, and conducted himself with the kind of forthright honesty that people do not forget. Josiah Webb wrote an obituary in the newspaper that was 4 paragraphs long and meant every word, and the new manager Forsyth came with his hat in his hands, and the Reverend from Harlow said things that were true rather than merely appropriate. They buried Thomas beside his wife, Mary, whose marker had stood in the small rise east of the house for 20 years. Elias stood at the grave with his children, Thomas James, now 2.5 years old, and solemn, in a way that suggested he understood something was important even if not precisely what, and Elena, who was too young to understand anything, but who was quiet in her father's arms in a way that seemed like solidarity. And Clara stood beside Elias with her hand in his, and the February wind came across the plains and moved the dry grass of the rise, and the sky was wide and gray and enormous. Pete cried openly and without any embarrassment, which Clara found more moving than she expected. Domingo removed his hat and stood for a long time after the service was over. Cully picked up a handful of Kansas dirt and held it for a moment and set it down carefully, a private ritual that no one commented on. The ranch went on. Ranches do. Spring came, and with it the particular energy of a property that needs to be managed rather than mourned, and Elias moved into the responsibilities of full ownership with the same steady, capable attention he had always brought to the work, and Clara moved into the management of the household with the same, and between them they carried it. There were good years and harder years, as there always are. There was a drought summer in 1884 that required grim decisions about the herd and tested everyone's endurance, and a late spring blizzard in 1885 that arrived without warning and lasted 3 days, and was afterward referred to as simply the March storm in a way that suggested everyone knew which one you meant. There was the expansion of the railroad that changed the cattle driving routes and required Elias to think differently about how he was moving cattle to market, and the conversations he and Clara had about strategy over the kitchen table in those years were the most practically serious of their partnership, and also, oddly, some of the ones she most enjoyed, because they were equal in them. She had not come west expecting equality. She had come west expecting work, which she had gotten, and the equality had arrived alongside the love in a way that she thought about sometimes with something approaching wonder. Elias had never, not once, suggested that her judgment was worth less than his because she was a woman. He had disagreed with her on specific things and been right sometimes and wrong other times, and she had been the same, and they had navigated it with the tools that they were always adding to: patience and honesty, and a fundamental willingness to believe the other person was operating in good faith even when it did not feel that way. Thomas James grew up on the ranch in the way that children who grow up on ranches do, with the land as a kind of second language, understanding it in the body and the instinct before the mind. And he was very like his father in the steadiness of him, and very like Clara in the precision of his thinking. By the time he was 7, he was following Elias through the days with the focused attention of apprenticeship, and Elias taught him the way old Thomas had taught him, not just the skills but the reasoning behind the skills, the why underneath the how. Elena was, as Thomas had predicted from her first week, fierce and loud and full of opinions, and she had Clara's practical intelligence and Elias' capacity for focused attention, and the combination produced a child who could argue a position with the thoroughness of a lawyer and then go help mend a fence with equal competence. Clara watched her daughter negotiate the world and felt something that she had no adequate word for, somewhere between recognition and hope. A third child came in 1886, another son they named William after no one in particular and who arrived in October, which made Clara laugh when she thought about it. October again. Everything that mattered seemed to want to happen in October. Pete retired from full ranch work that year, at 59, with the arthritic knees that a lifetime of that kind of labor tends to produce, and he did not leave. He stayed in the bunkhouse and helped with lighter tasks and spent a great deal of time with the children and occasionally expressed opinions about how things were being done that everyone listened to, because he was almost always right. Elias built him a proper chair for the bunkhouse porch, a good solid chair with a back that accommodated Pete's particular way of sitting, and Pete sat in it every morning and looked at the ranch, he had spent most of his adult life on, with the contentment of a man who has ended up where he was supposed to be. Domingo went home to Sonora for good in 1887, when his father became ill and his family needed him, and it was a genuine sadness to see him go. They stood in the yard when the wagon came to take him to the stage, and he shook Elias' hand and then Clara's, and looked at the children with the particular warmth he had always shown them and said, "This is a good place. I am glad I was part of it for a while." "You will always be part of it," Elias said. Domingo looked at him with a directness that had been one of the things Clara had most valued in him, that complete unguarded honesty, and said, "Yes, I believe that." He wrote from Sonora in 1888 to say that his father had recovered and that he had married and that he was well. Clara wrote back a letter of 4 pages that covered everything she thought he would want to know about the ranch and the people in it, and his reply to that letter was one she kept. Cully left in 1889 under circumstances that were not entirely clear and in the direction of Nevada, having received a letter that changed his plans, and he shook everyone's hand in his way and rode west one morning without ceremony. They never heard from him again, which was consistent with who he was, and they hoped he was all right. New hands came over the years, good ones and less good ones, and the ranch employed as many as 6 at its peak in the late 1880s, when the operation had grown to the point where 6 were needed. Clara managed the household accounts and the correspondence and had, by 1888, also taken on a role in the county school board that was formal and recognized, the first woman to hold such a position in that county, which created some friction with the men who thought it was not appropriate and considerable approval from the women who had been waiting for it, and which she discharged with the practical thoroughness that she brought to everything. Josiah Webb covered the school board appointment in the newspaper with a paragraph that was warmer than strictly journalistic, and she was grateful for it and told him so. Elias turned 35 in 1888 and she turned 33, and they celebrated by riding to the high point of the south pasture in the October afternoon, without the children for once, just the 2 of them, and sitting on their horses and looking at what they had built, the ranch spreading below them, the house solid and warm-lit in the early evening, the barn full, the cattle visible in the east pasture as a dark moving shape against the gold grass. 11 years, she said. 11 years, he said. She thought about October of 1877, the wagon, the fire, the smoke, the man she had not yet known who had been beating at the flames with a wet saddle blanket, and she thought about every October since, each one another year added to the total, each year another layer of knowing him and this place and herself in it. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me the first October?" He thought for a moment. "I said you were going to ruin your dress," he said. She laughed. "You did." "You said it was already ruined by the stage from Dodge," he said. "It was," she said. He was quiet, looking at the ranch below. Then he said, "You could have left. The contract was for a year. You could have left in October of 1879 and gone back to St. Louis or anywhere else." "You asked me to stay," she said. "I did," he said. "You asked me to stay just one more winter," she said. "And then I did not leave. And then you asked me properly." He looked at her with the directness that had not changed in 11 years, had only deepened, and said, "I have been asking you ever since, in every way I know how." She reached across and he took her hand, and they sat at the high point of the south pasture in the October light, and the plains went out in every direction beneath the sky that she had loved since the first night she had seen it properly, and she thought that this was exactly the life she had not known to want and had somehow found anyway, and she was grateful for it with a completeness that required no more specific language than that. "I have been saying yes," she said. "Every time. I have been saying yes ever since." He brought her hand to his mouth and held it there for a moment, and the wind came across the grass and moved it in long waves, and the light was going golden and then amber, and then the particular deep orange of a Kansas autumn evening, and the first star came out in the east while the west was still burning down to purple. They rode home in the early dark, side by side the way they had ridden most of their important distances together, and the lights of the house came up warm and certain through the trees Clara had planted in 1880 that were taller now than either of them. And Thomas James was in the barn doing the evening feeding with the capable ease of a 10-year-old who has been doing it for 2 years. And Alina was on the porch watching the sky with that focused attention that was so like her father. And William was somewhere inside making the particular kind of noise that 3-year-olds make when they have been patient long enough and are done with patience. Elias stopped his horse at the gate and looked at all of it. She stopped beside him and watched him look, and she saw on his face what she had first seen in the June garden in 1879 when she had said yes, that slow opening, that window raised, that light in a room long closed. All right, he said to himself or to her or to the whole of it, she was not sure. All right. They went inside. The years that followed were years of ordinary, extraordinary life, which is the best kind and the hardest to describe because its power is cumulative rather than dramatic, built in the mornings and evenings rather than in the crises. There were crises, there always are, a drought, a herd illness, a winter that pushed hard against everything they had, but they met each one the way they had always met difficult things, steadily and together, and with the resource that comes from years of genuinely knowing another person. Thomas James grew into a young man who had his grandfather's name and something of his presence, that particular quality of taking up exactly the right amount of space, no more and no less. He worked the ranch with his father and had ideas about it that were sometimes better than Elias' existing approach, and which Elias listened to, with the openness of a man who had always valued good thinking over the source of it. By the time he was 16, he was in every practical sense running significant parts of the operation alongside his father, and the conversations between them at the kitchen table in the evenings had the quality of something that had been building for a long time and was now complete. Alina went to school in Harlow and read every book she could get her hands on and argued about everything with a precision and a joy that Clara recognized in herself from 20 years ago. Clara taught her what she knew and learned from her what she did not know and watched her daughter become someone specific and fully formed in the way that only people who have been genuinely encouraged do. Alina was going to be formidable. She already was. William was the surprise of their children. Where Thomas James was steady and Alina was fierce, William was gentle, with an easy warmth that made everyone like him within 5 minutes and a talent for growing things that expressed itself early and stayed. He was the one who took over Clara's kitchen garden and expanded it, who understood plants in the way that Domingo had understood weather, in the body and the instinct before the mind. He grew up with his hands in the dirt and was entirely happy about it. Clara turned 40 in 1894, and Elias turned 41 the same year, and they were older and different from the people who had stood in the smoke of a brush fire in October of 1877, but not different in the way of diminishment. Different in the way of more. He was more gray at his temples, and the lines around his eyes were deeper, and his hands showed the years in them. And she loved his face with its history written on it the way she loved the land for the same reason. She knew that her own face had changed, and she did not mourn it because it seemed like the right trade. You become the years you have lived, and she had lived good ones. They sat on the porch one October evening, 17 years since she had arrived, and the sky did what it always did in October, that blue going amber going purple going dark with the stars coming on one by one the way they always had, and Pete in his chair on the bunkhouse porch across the yard, and the sound of children somewhere inside the house. "Do you remember," Elias said, "the first night you saw this sky?" "Christmas Eve," she said. 1878. The storm paused. "You said you were glad you had come," he said. "I was," she said. "I am." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him the way that has become unconscious after 17 years, the way of two people who have adjusted themselves to each other, until the accommodation is no longer an effort but simply the natural position. "I am glad too," he said. "Every day. I am glad every single day." She put her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder. The stars came out above the Kansas plains in their millions, and the wind moved the tall grass in the darkness beyond the fence, and the house behind them was warm and full. And she thought about the woman who had stood in a wagon watching a fire and jumped down before the wheels stopped turning, and thought that woman had not known what she was jumping toward. She knew now. She had known for a long time. She had been saying yes ever since.